Brandon Showalter, a lot to break down today about the Federal Trade Commission and a story that recently came out about an event coming up in July, a one-day event that could be a very big deal on this transgender debate. Can you tell us what'll be happening?
Yes, the Federal Trade Commission has just announced, and this broke via the Daily Wire, that they're going to be putting on an event, a workshop full of panels and speakers, where they will address the fraud of so called gender affirming care. For those who don't know what the Federal Trade Commission does, they are the regulatory agency in the federal government that looks out for consumers. They police unjust, unfair trade acts and practices, and consumer fraud matters, and they do that with, big tech and any sort of sector where the federal government has regulatory and investigative power to where consumers are being defrauded. That's the FTC's purview. The current chairman of the FTC, Andrew Ferguson, has spoken previously about tackling so-called gender-affirming care, especially for minors, through his agency, and now uh, Federal Trade Commissioner Mark Metter, who just joined the commission. It's looking like they have the votes to, as a commission, classify so-called gender-affirming care for minors as a kind of consumer fraud or unjust trade practices. But the event in July will serve as the precursor to that. There are so many kinds of fraud that are inherent in these transgender medical practices, namely the fraud that it's possible to be born in the wrong body. And that's the premise on which all of these medical treatments is based. And so no medical treatment, especially given how it's marketed to children and their families, is going to actually solve the problem, given that it begins with an irretrievably flawed uh, baseline. And so the Federal Trade Commission will be looking into that, in addition to the other kinds of fraud that go on within these spaces at their meeting in July. And again, that would be the precursor, very likely, for them taking even more decisive investigative or regulatory action against these procedures nationwide.
It is very complicated, all of these the stories we've seen, the information. When I say complicated, what I mean is the media does often not present the entire story. You have, more than anyone, looked at this issue, you have analyzed it, you have assessed it. You have seen more than anyone else, I think, when it comes to personal stories, data, information, research that has come out on this. What is the biggest thing that you see when it comes to a lie or fraud from your perspective on this transgender issue, particularly when it comes to children?
Well, the big lie, and that's actually what the Federal Trade Commission is proposing that they call this event, is about this very thing. And I would say that the big lie is that it's actually possible for a human being, especially children, to change sex. Um, Human sex cannot be changed. It's impossible for DNA to go from XX chromosomes to XY chromosomes and vice versa. And so, what the gender activists will often do is feed you this line, well, we're not trying to change sex, we're trying to change gender, as though that's somehow different. But it's all gaslighting, it's all deception. And so, all of the practices that flow, again, from that flawed premise, try to make a lie somehow real. And so, when you're altering the body in pursuit of a physically impossible goal, that of becoming the opposite sex, and you have an industry that surrounds that, both with counseling to that end and also medical practices where you're administering drugs like puberty blockers like Lupron, cross-sex hormones like synthetic estrogen or synthetic testosterone, or surgeries that remove physically healthy body parts. You've got the lie materializing, the lie that it's possible to change sex, and all of the other industries that surround it. And so, being born in the wrong body, that's an unfalsifiable claim. How can you prove that your body, your sex body, is somehow wrong? Um, this is why, and I'll just say that the agency is taking action in keeping with President Trump's January 28th executive order that decried so-called gender-affirming care as a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. And so it empowered federal agencies to take appropriate action wherever possible to bring an end to this scourge. The Justice Department and the Health and Human Services Department also have taken action in recent days, but I think the Federal Trade Commission's move addressing this big lie that it's somehow possible to change sex and that children can consent to medical procedures in pursuit of that lie is likely to be some of the most consequential that we will see, at least at the federal level.
I want to dig a little more into this because this lie, this claim that not only is this possible to transition, but that if you don't, as a parent, your child might commit suicide, they might kill themselves. You have to do this to save their life.
Right.
There is now research coming out on this. For a long time, this was the claim that was being made to justify these quote unquote treatments. And now we're seeing at least two studies that I've heard of. I'm sure you've seen more that are giving a very different take. Can you dig a little bit more into that so people understand what the research, when you follow the science, which is a term we've often used, is actually telling us now?
Right. Yeah, the suicide lie is by far the worst emotional blackmail. And when it's parroted in clinical settings with a doctor wearing their white coats with their degrees on the wall, it carries great social trust. And so parents who are led to believe that their children might die unless they undergo these treatments. I mean, I don't even like to dignify this medicalization with nice clinical language because it's anything but. It's experimental and it's brutal and it's abusive. But that's the crux of it because no parent wants to see their child wind up dead. So you mentioned the big lie. Well, that's when it's marketed and presented to people with those false claims. Those are the exact kind of practices that are just so deceptive. With respect to studies that have been done, the major one that is of note, and this was referenced in the recent HHS report, was out of England called the Cass report. Now, people have their quibbles with the Cass report, and I understand why, but the main thrust of it is absolutely correct that the evidence for transing children is paper thin. It shows no evidence that it actually has a greater that it decreases suicide. There's no evidence to show that. The pediatrician in England that led the report, Dr. Hilary Cass, spent years meticulously analyzing all of the data from all of the studies that we have of so-called, gender dysphoric children, and it's just not there. Even in the Supreme Court, which when the Scrutiny case was adjudicated back in December, Justice Alito brought up to the ACLU attorney who was arguing along with the government that these treatments should be allowed for children in the state of Tennessee because Tennessee had passed a law that had banned these practices of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries. Justice Alito asked the attorney, "Do you want to retract from your previous statement in the record saying that these things reduce suicide?" When in fact the Cass report out of England said otherwise. And the attorney's response was, "Well, it tried to make a difference between completed suicide and suicidality." They tried to sort of find that wiggle room to say, well, it decreases suicide ideation, and that's a good outcome instead of completed suicide. So they keep trying to worm their way around and still try to make people believe that suicide ideation and actual suicide are kind of one and the same. That's the manipulation that's happening around that. But yes, that's by far the worst outcome. But the trans activists and their allies in the medical field will continue to sing this song about other purported benefits of these treatments, like better mood or better mental health or something. Meanwhile, there's not a there. We know conclusively now, given how European nations, including the UK, are backpedaling, that the risks of these drugs and surgeries, among them permanent sterility and reduced bone growth, are far outweigh any purported benefits, and they're scaling back. They're not doing these things to children near as much, except with some very, tight research or settings, which I think, frankly, should be abolished too, because all of it's based on a lie that you can be born in the wrong body and that you can transition your sex when that's impossible. So the suicide claim, again, is by far the most deliberate emotional blackmail. And I think that's honestly, again, why the FTC is taking such an interest in it, because no doctor should be able to lie to you and emotionally blackmail you about a treatment protocol for your child who may very well be distressed, but in fact it's just that. So that's fraud, and no consumer should have to face that in a medical setting, especially. That's just egregious practice.
One of the things that people might not realize is that you, as somebody who has looked at this as a reporter, as a journalist, as a member of the media, you have looked at every angle of it. You have a podcast, Generation Indoctrination, and you have done incredible, numerous seasons now on this show. You are preparing for the release of a new season of the show. I'd love for you to talk, for those who don't know, about the podcast and what people can expect in a new season.
Yes, we are in season 5. We're working on season 5 right now, and it's crazy to think just how much it has developed over time. Our first season was produced in the fall of 2022, and to say that the world has changed since then would be the understatement of the century. And last season, during season 4, we took a look at those who were taking action to resist the onslaught of gender ideology. It seemed that the general public really woke up, in my estimation, in 2023. And I say that because that was the year when 17 states, in that year alone, passed restrictions on blockers, hormones, and surgery. And so finally, the issue was forced into the public consciousness in a way that it wasn't before. Prior to that year, I think only Arkansas, Alabama, and Arizona had passed restrictions, and it was still sort of on the margins. But then we saw mainstream news outlets start to profile detransitioners. The victims became visible. The Biden administration was furiously pushing these policies. People were coming forward saying, no, this is wrong. I don't agree with this. And in the 2024 election, according to Blueprint postmortem analysis, in the swing states, Kamala Harris's support for transgender issues lost her the swing states by 28 points when they were measured about what kind of issues mattered to people, to voters in those states in the election. So it wound up the 2023, 17 states in that year alone, awareness building that it did um, really created some momentum around the issue in a way that I think maybe even the Trump campaign was surprised by. So season 4, we took a look at those who were working to help detransitioners and help families and empower people who were seeing this for the threat that it is. And now that there has been such a tremendous sea change, certainly in the federal government, as we've been talking about today with the Federal Trade Commission taking action, we're looking at how the landscape has changed. Season 5 will explore what's being done to pick up the pieces, because this is like a bomb has gone off and the fallout is going to be profound from the blast of this thing. And so we certainly do not want to declare victory over the gender scourge prematurely, but we're going to be taking a look at some other victims. I'm working on an episode about the siblings of young people who had to grow up with this in their families, but they were minors before. But now that they're adults, they can speak about what it was like to watch their brothers and sisters collapse into transgender confusion. We're going to be taking a look at the state of Alabama, because Alabama was one of the first states to really tackle this head on. And their efforts, especially in the Attorney General's office, it cannot be overstated the outsized role that they play in exposing the harms of this stuff and some of the scandals that have gone on within the bowels of our government. The Alabama Attorney General's office, when history is written, they deserve enormous credit. And we're also going to be taking a look at how the landscape has changed. And I do agree with the author Abigail Schreier, who wrote in the Free Press on the heels of President Trump's executive order decrying the chemical and surgical transing of kids, that the gender mania, the fever, has broken. There will always be gender confused people out there. Gender ideology will always exist in some form, I'm sure. But the mania that has swallowed a generation and swept through the culture, she believes, and I believe, that it's over. But we're going to be taking a look at those who've been impacted, but also how do we pick up the pieces, because there's a lot of history and there's so much damage that has not gone reported because of the derelict reporting of the press, that we in the alternative media and the Christian media have been doing the original shoe leather journalistic work to cover, because the stories of the families who've been ripped to shreds and the stories of the young people who've been irreversibly harmed, they need to be told and honored, and this chapter in history must never be forgotten.
And, to your point too, a lot of people who haven't even realized yet, who have been, entrapped in this, who are going to come out of it at some point, right? I mean, there's people who are in the middle of this still who don't even realize what they are in the middle of. Last question for you. As a human being, as a Christian, as a reporter, as a member of the media, how has this changed you? I know that's a lot of different areas, but how has covering this issue maybe changed your heart and your mind over these last few years?
There are many ways in which and it's been such a long journey. I've been digging into this for over 8 years now, and it's kind of I know it's an odd, bizarre thing to focus on, and some people don't understand why it matters to me and matters to us at the Christian Post so much. But I've just been working on a presentation I'm about to give here in a few weeks where I underscore the importance of telling the truth. But it's so consequential because this strikes at the heart of the gospel. For me as a Christian and for me as a member of the Christian media, if we twist and distort Genesis 1, we have distorted the entire gospel. And I think the worst spiritual warfare today centers on our anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being made male and female in God's image and likeness? And if we don't have anything to say to that, I don't know what we're even doing as Christians. We have nothing to say. The gospel will have no meaning. And so this is a necessary truth to contend for. And even if you want to make the argument that the numbers of people in this country that are impacted by the medicalization of gender with blockers, hormones, and surgery is relatively small when we think of 330 million people in this country, I would submit that that is missing the point entirely because the ideology is diabolical and it is everywhere. It's in our government, it's in our schools, it's in our media, it's in our prisons, it's everywhere. You fill out a document, you see traces of this diabolical death cult affecting your life. We as Christians are determined, especially the Christian Post, are determined to be the fly in the ointment and stand up and say no. And we're going to, as our executive editor, Dr. Richard Land likes to put it, we're going to fight for every single brick in the wall in the spirit of Nehemiah. This is not acceptable. It is not acceptable to tell children that they can be born in the wrong body. It's not acceptable to be our own God and say that we're going to change ourselves and exalt ourselves by telling God he made a mistake, that we can be the other sex just because we say so. No, this is some of the most pernicious, self-centered idolatry that has ever existed. And so even if people who read us, many non-Christian readers now read the Christian Post because of our coverage on these issues, even if they disagree with us theologically, it's just not rational either. Gender ideology, as my good friend Jay Richards likes to say, it assaults our natural reason. It assaults what we see with our eyes. And because the assault of that is so profound, that's exactly why it has to be defeated. And we must continue to be as unequivocal as we can possibly be. So I think it's changed me just in the fact that it's affected how I see the gospel and why it's important to contend for these foundational truths. They really matter because we want to be consistent and bold witnesses for the truth. But I think the other thing is that you can't contend against something so wicked and so evil and not be changed by it. It really puts you in touch with radical iniquity and evil and depravity. And you have to be really reliant on the goodness of Jesus Christ in order to withstand the onslaught of it. It does really test your mettle when you're forced to confront wickedness in a way that I think most Americans would just prefer not to see. We live our nice, cushy Western lives, and you don't want to even have to think about something so unpleasant. But then when you come face to face with it and you've got distraught parents and siblings in your inbox talking about how their children are chemically sterile and disintegrating, can you help me? My son or daughter got Planned Parenthood hormones and they're now being harmed by it. What can you do to help me? You can't just ignore that. And you can't just shy away and just wish them well. So I think those two things that really sort of articulate why it has changed me and changed all of us at the Christian Post. I mean, we see this as a really important issue because of, again, what it means for the gospel, but just how many people have been harmed for it. And scripture commands us to speak out for those who have no voice. And so many of these people don't really have a voice, and we're going to defend the marginalized in our society.
Truth has to be our compass. And when you see people being abused, and that kind of comes back to the FTC and what we're going to see happen potentially in the coming weeks and months, you have to speak out and speak up. And Brandon, you have done that so beautifully well. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Billy. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more Christ-centered journalism.